You are watching an online intensive of the Dance of the Eye and the Hand, Introduction to Color, Lesson 4. This is our last session in this 4-session intensive on color, and today we're going to do several things. We're going to first add our person in the boat, and then add another layer to the rocks and foreground, and some more depth to the dots in the trees and the shrubs. And we'll start with the person in the boat so that that's dry by the time we want to get back and put some color on it. So I'll start by getting my brush a little bit wet. I'm using a small detail brush to do this boat and person. I want something that has a stiff hair, but I can get a good point on it. Load up a little bit of ink. And I'm going to dry this fairly well because I don't want too much of a spread. So I'll start here in the corner. We'll start with the top line of the boat. And then its bow. And then going back. And then I will add the bottom. And then add my little person in, a couple of legs, their body, a head, just a little bit of a top knot there, and then arms, and whether it's a tiller or something else, I'm not quite sure what it is. And just a couple of ribs, and there's my boat. So then I'll put this brush aside for now, and we're going to start at the top, just adding a little more burnt sienna color, a little more depth. I'm going to mix up a little burnt sienna here. Don't need it too full strength, but enough to get a little more depth there. So I'll start in the back, and again I'm supporting these outlines or shading lines. So where they're going horizontal, I'm going horizontal with them to support that general trend. Here again, supporting those outlines or shading lines. And then down here as well. This is fairly dry. Not putting a lot of liquid in it at this point, but just bringing a little more depth of color down. Now I'm going to add some liquid to it so that this blends. So while before the ink has dried, color has dried, I'm using water to spread it and mix it so that I don't get a hard line along where I just put that wash. And then I'll get some transition. And I'm just going to add loose wash down here, bring it down a little bit, so a little bit of color down in the water. We'll come back and add some more gray tones to this in just a little bit. Now I'm going to shift my attention to the lower part of the painting, and again just continuing with this burnt sienna, just adding another layer. Again, working fairly wet with this, trying to get this bottom form a little more distinct. It's like a foreground hill. And here working fairly wet just to take the white out. I don't want too much white in this bottom section. So I'm taking out as much of the white as I can, just leaving a little bit down here to show the difference between that very foreground piece and what's behind it. And I'll put a little more up here. Just adding some more texture in, and I can do that with a fairly dry brush and some scraping movements. And then I think my little boat is dry. I'm going to take a little bit of the burnt sienna for that. A little bit more. And just add a little bit of color to that boat so it pops. Now, at some point, one stops looking at the model and just looks at what you've created and how are you going to make that work. And it could be that you didn't allow enough room here for this boat. Well, you might want to put it over here. Or the trees got too tall, so you want to shorten this up. This is called making corrections. So I'm still going to follow the model for the next couple of steps, but then we'll get to a point where we put the model away and we just say, what can I do to this painting to make it work? I'm going to make one other correction already. This one roof is just a little bit too light. And I want to darken that up a bit. Okay. Now I'm going to switch to doing another layer of green dots, and so I start with some indigo. And just a titch or two of yellow. And compared to this dried back pretty almost, I'd say limey. I want to get it a little more blue-green, dry my brush, just take the tip, test it. I want to go a little bit darker. Remembering that colors dry back significantly, so if it looks like what you want, you probably have not made it dark enough. Generally, if things look darker than you want them, you're probably on the mark. Now I have a nice blue-green, and I'm going to come back into where we started with these trees, start with the host tree, and make some more dots. And here, these I want fairly loose, so you can have a fair amount of liquid or water in them. And again, I don't want to take out all the white, but I want to take out a lot of the white. And I'll open it up towards the top so that I have a transition from the dots that are gathered to the ones that are more scattered. Want to avoid anything that looks like a pattern or line, edge. You want your dots to have some energy to them. And they can vary in size. Some of these are fairly big, some of them are a little smaller. And again, I don't want to cover the outline of my trunk or my branches. I want to still be able to see that, so you're working generally next to those pieces. And then a couple of what we would call show-off dots, just to get a little extra punch of energy in there. They sort of look like they're jumping off the tree. A little more down here. Okay, I'll stop with that. Then I'm going to continue with some of these background. They're almost like bushes. Go around the rock here. And then over here beside the little houses here. And here, these dots are going over the outline of that edge, so that we're putting some of these shrubbery or bushes in front of that hill. Some of them are behind. And I went a little fast here, and so I'm getting some bleeding here. We'll let that dry and fix that in a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to go back to some ink. I'm switching brushes here, and I'm just going to mix up a fairly light, middle to light gray. Dry my brush again. Just take a bit so I don't have too much bleeding. And I'm going to come down here and add in some gray in this foreground. So where I put the least amount of color, I'm now putting in some gray, still allowing a little bit of white to stay there. Just going to get this a little more, but not too much. Now some of this is wet, so I'm getting a nice sort of bleed in this. Not a straight line or a clear line, but more varied. Add some of that here. If I press a bit, I can get a nice bleed there. So you're sort of almost working both wet and dry at the same time. Add a little more gray up here just to solidify. And a little more gray in the base here in this foreground hill, just to solid. Make that solid as well. And then I'm going to add just a titch of some gray at the base of these rocks, just to give them a little more weight, lower center of gravity, blur up some of these. Okay. Now I'm going to continue with that gray wash going out into the water and just creating some movement. This is sort of a light gray. I'm using very much the side of the brush. If I go lightly, I get a dry stroke. If I slow down, I can get a wet stroke. So by changing your speed, you can go from wet to dry stroke without changing anything in the brush. And what I'm doing is I'm pressing as I go to the left, because I want this area on the left to have more weight or closure to it, more open as we go to the right, which then creates the sense of space. Bringing some of these lines down, again pressing. This is almost pure water, but not completely. And again, just pulling off, leaving some white, but leaving some, having it create more of a density here, and opens up, which creates the space going to the right. I'm going to add a little more of the gray to the distant mountains, the base there. I'm working a little bit darker, but because that background is still wet, I'll get a nice bleed. So I can blend with what's already there because I'm working wet on wet. And we'll add just a little more gray here just to add some weight. And we're working towards the base of that outline. So this gets solid, which pops this forward. This gets solid, which pops what's outside the outline a little closer to you. Now I'm working fairly dry and really a little more ink in my brush, so I'm getting some darker tones, but I'm doing it basically rubbing to get some texture. But it's a very dry brush. Okay. Now we'll let that dry completely, and then we will come back and add our final layer of ink and any other corrections that we need to make. So let's let this dry for about, 10 minutes. So now we'll continue with going back to having a little bit of ink, fresh brush here, working with my wolf brush, hard surface, hard haired brush, picking up a little bit of ink. I don't need too much, but it needs to be good ink. And I'm going to start with these trees. We'll go back to our host tree and just add another layer of dots. And I'm putting these, some to reinforce the black dots that are already there, and then to also extend their reach and blend them with the green that I had just applied at the beginning of this lesson. And again, I want to avoid anything that looks like a pattern or a line. You want them to really be moving like leaves would do. So the shape can be a little bit varied. But I'm just sort of, if this were a tire, I would be pumping it up, making it plump with leaves. And also remembering part of what I'm doing is also giving structure to the unseen structure. So I know some of these trunks branch off, and what I'm doing with my dots is also showing what that structure might be. I'm feeling a little bit of the wind coming through some of those leaves. Adding more here to this last one, and I'm going over some of what I've put in place so I get a thicker density to it, and adding to it as well. So sometimes it's just one layer, sometimes it's many layers of dots that I'm will be left with. And while I'm at it, I'm looking at this. This doesn't look as sturdy and solid as I would like it, so I'll add a little bit of reinforcement here, a little more strength to some of these lines. So now we're moving a bit into doing some corrections, but I want these branches to really hold, to have some substance. Even though they're just thin little twigs, I want them to have some punch to them. So I will reinforce some of the structure that I didn't quite get strong enough the first time. Maybe my ink wasn't strong enough, or my stroke wasn't strong enough. And again, this is in the realm of doing corrections. How do we modify a painting to make it stronger once we've got the basics in? Do a little bit more over here. Now I'm going to move down into the rocks, and there are dots both on top of the rocks, in front of that top outline, and also going upward to connect and hold the base of those trees. So I am obscuring the very bottoms of those trees to help hold them in place. Adding some dots here, a little more spare at the end of the bottom of these rocks. Now as I go up this hill here in front of these buildings, I have a nice little grouping of rocks. I have dots where they've, if you will, have gathered. And these are more like show-off dots. I'm going to notice them because I noticed the buildings, so I want to be sure they have enough punch and energy to them. I'll continue back over here on the base of the rocks. Just a few at the bottom, some between the rocks. And over here on the right of this one, some more dots behind that rock, and also alongside its deeper edge here. Give it a little more depth, and the dots continue right off the page, and again obscuring some of the base. So we're adding more what I call a lower center of gravity. So bringing that weight down. I still have a little bit of white at the top of those rocks. And just a couple more. And I can come back once I have all my other dots in place and review the whole painting. Now I'm just going to continue over to this hillside. There are dots behind this little roof line, so that brings those houses or buildings closer. And I'm just adding another layer of black dots here. I could have done them earlier, I didn't, but you could have done those earlier and put the green on top of it. I like to do them last because then I can really be sure I'm getting the kind of punch and energy that I need to enliven the painting. But again, dots are gathered or scattered, so in some places I'm putting them quite close to each other. Some of them have escaped and gotten away, and some of them are just lying on top of each other. And again, I've obscured that line. I know it's under there, but I don't need to show it. Now I'm going to shift my attention to the distant mountain, and again adding some dots to support the outline, and in some cases to obscure it. And while these are distant mountains, the dots aren't necessarily that much smaller. They're a little bit, but again, we are working with more complicated rules of perspective in Chinese painting. It's not a single point of perspective and distance treated the same way. Sometimes things that are in the distance are the same size as they are in the foreground. They're just might be done a little more simply, a little less detail, but they may not change in size to speak of. So this closes this edge, which makes this appear bigger. So we're doing, creating the sense of distance just by where we put some of these dots. And dots are like dessert. You'd really like to start with them, but they're best if you wait till the end, because then you can put them in the places where they need to be. And because you're copying a model, but copying doesn't mean photocopy. It means that you're trying to get the sense of it, trying to catch at least some of the energy that the original painter put into it. Now these are more vertical dots, these little ones that are out in the water. Maybe they're small trees or reeds or maybe some rocks. I'm not sure exactly what they are. I'm just going to add a little more definition to some of these lines. They got a little bit light, and I want a little more weight up here. So it's really very dry scraping lines, and just a few of them here. And again, this is all in the sense of doing some corrections and working with the painting as you have created it, not necessarily as the model had. I'm going to add one more thing that I maybe should have added sooner, but I'm going to make a nice middle gray. There we go. There were some more of these little vertical slashes that are in the distance here, and I'm going to add them so that that middle piece here gets just a little more depth to it. And I think there's a few up here too. And while I'm doing that, I'm also going to add down in here, I now see there's another layer of gray dots that I didn't catch on to early on, but will be helpful just to add a little more depth to some of this. And I have a few more over here I want to do. Just a couple. So again, it just adds a little more texture, a little more depth. And I think I'll call that complete. Then the last thing to really make the thing complete is to add a date and a name. And I'll go back to my detail brush, load it up with ink again. And so the date, so you don't have a lot of room, so you either have to make it very small or you could just do the year and then your name if you have one. So we'll start with 2, 0, 2, 1 is our year. And maybe I'll do that, and the month, it's still 3rd month, and I'll leave it at that. So there's still a little bit of air between the inscription and the painting. Then again, small, as best I can. I'll add my name. I'm doing it just a little bit indented, a little bit farther down than the date. And usually the date is first, the name to the left of that. And there we have a complete landscape. Foreground, trees, host tree, other trees, distant mountains, some reflections in the water, our boat person, and then date and name, and we have a complete landscape. So let's give that a try. Before you go, please note there's a PDF on the website for each lesson containing the models for each lesson and supplementary material for each lesson. You have been watching Distance Learning from Laughing Waters Studio.